What I thought we'd do this week is I would show you a video I did for Bible Lab, and it's all about context. I love context so much. I think it's so fun. And not only do I think it's fun, I think it is critical that we understand context before we start trying to understand the passage. This is a mistake that I think is made so often when we read the Bible, that we do not understand how it felt to the people inside the Bible, in the pages of the Bible. What did it look like? What did it smell like? What did it taste like? What did it feel like? What did they hear? In this video, we get into the skin of Luke, who wrote the book of Luke. He actually wrote Acts as well. Keep in mind, I'll be calling you Bible Lab. I'll be saying when tonight we're not doing anything. That was specifically to them, but I thought maybe you might like it. I am so ready for this video. I have been looking forward to it all week long. I will try to tuck in my excitement, but we're going to be talking about context. The very first Bible Lab that we talked about context was right here in this living room, and I was so excited that night. I knew everybody was going to be hopping in and figuring out the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and I could just feel it. I just knew it. Boy, did my bubble pop as the night sort of progressed on. I think it was Heidi. Heidi, you'll have to say if this was you or not. Heidi being the first one to be like, why does this matter? And then as she said that, then everybody else is like, yeah, what she said. Like, yes, we're wondering the same thing. Why does context matter? And I'm like, are you serious, guys? Do you think this is boring? And they're like, yeah, kind of. We are approaching context differently these days. And so that's what we're doing tonight. It's going to be fun, I think. Let's first really quickly just wrap our brains around what exactly is context. The dictionary would say that context starts with an event or a situation, and then around that event and situation are the circumstances, like the details that give insight into that event or circumstance. Take a listen to this 30-second video where we're going to see the event is a birthday party. The context around the birthday party really matters. See if you can spot what it is.
How are you the last one to show up to your own party? That is messed up. Your birthday party? What are you talking about?
Do it!
What?
Surprise party!
Surprise party?
Are you drunk?
Of course I am. It's a party.
You guys can come out. Derek messed us up. Seriously!
Tell me where all the cars were.
How stupid can you be?
Why don't you just say it's a surprise party?
There's people here to sing happy birthday. Thanks a lot, Derek.
Happy birthday. I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot, Derek. Poor drunk Derek. Obviously, we see that the birthday party, the events, the surrounding context was it's a surprise party. We have to know that context to understand the birthday party, right? Or it's ruined. Here's what we can take away. Context brings clarity. Context always brings clarity if the context is correct. So why are we here? We are here to gather around the Bible to know God more through his word and do that together. Understanding is where we're headed. Well, we need context. We need that clarity, which means we are going to become like detectives. We're going to be snooping. We're going to be spying. We're going to be researching, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I promise this time, Heidi, it's going to be fun. So just keep this in mind. As we open the Bible tonight, we are going to be looking for context clues. And I'm going to go first by sharing with you guys some context clues that I have found out about the Gospel of Luke. The reason that I'm doing context for the book of Luke is because that's mostly where we're going to land. That's going to be sort of our home base. So I thought it makes a lot of sense for us to start with our big picture context in the book of Luke. Okay, the first thing to note is there's many kinds of context. I'm going to give you a few. You don't even have to write these down. Don't worry about it for now. But I want you to know that there's more official language than what we're going to give it. I always like to simplify things. But if we're going to be fancy-pantsy, there is historical context, there's grammatical context, there's scriptural context, there is literary context. There is something called visual context, which I think is stretching it a bit. We'll talk about that later. There's geographical context. I'm sure I'm missing one or two, but you get the picture. There's a lot of different ways we can look at context. For tonight, you don't have to worry about any of those. The only two we're going to worry about are literary context, which I'm going to give you, which it's been reported this is the snooze fest context. We're going to jazz it up a bit. And the second kind of context that we're going to look at tonight, which is actually what you're going to be doing in your think work, Andy and I have made up. We're going to call it relational context. Head, heart, hands. All right, hang with me on the literary context of the book of Luke because it's really going to pull some pieces for us together. The first question that we ask when we're looking through the lens of literary context is, what is the genre? This should always be our very first question when we open any book of the Bible. We need to know, is this a letter, like written from a person to a group of people? Is this a narrative or history, like a story? Is this prophecy? Is it wisdom literature? Is it a poem? Because we don't read a poem the same way that we read history. So we always want to answer this question first. What is the genre of the Gospel of Luke? I think we all probably know this is a narrative. It is the story of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. The next question that we're going to ask is, who wrote this book? Listen, I am so excited about Luke. I did not know him very much, but we've gotten to know one another over this last week. The third question we're going to ask is, who was the book written to? Well, technically, the correct answer is someone named Theophilus. Now, the name Theophilus means beloved of God or friend of God. Some think that this is just like a general made-up person that Luke is introducing this book to. I don't think that's probably true. Most scholars would say this is actually written to a man named Theophilus. And probably that man was a Roman official. And the reason that we think that may be is because to the most excellent Theophilus, that leads us to believe that it's more than likely he was some sort of Roman official with status. Also, do I tell you this now? It is thought that it is possible that Theophilus actually commissioned Luke to write both Luke and Acts. Because listen, it took money. Think of a contemporary writer and the years it takes, the research, the effort, the scrolls. We don't need scrolls now, but he did. He needed the parchment papers. Those cost money. The ink, the pens. I know this sounds little, but it was not little. He also had to eat during that time. Luke did. So he needed money to survive. And it is thought that probably Theophilus is the one who commissioned Luke to do this years-long journey of writing both Luke and Acts. So we could say that is specifically who it's written to, but like if we pan back out and say, well, in general, who was this written to? It's written to the common man. Most of the book of Luke, 99.9% of the book of Luke, is written in very low-level language that could be easily understood by those who were not educated. So it's for the common person. Now, where was the book of Luke written? When you go searching context, do not be alarmed to see that there's lots of different opinions. I'm just going to give you the one that after reading, I came to the conclusion through looking at 4 or 5 different sources. I would say it's probably most likely that Luke was in Caesarea. Now, let's take a look at exactly where Caesarea was in the ancient world. Now, if we pan down into where Caesarea is, I want you to see that it's very near Jerusalem. It's in Judea. So this is at the center point of where Jesus's ministry was happening. Now, there's another thing to note is that Luke was here in Caesarea, not just because he's actually not from Caesarea. He's there because he was Paul's companion. And guess what? Our friend Paul is in jail. I say he was in jail. He was under house arrest. And at this point, it was 2 years that Paul was under house arrest, which many scholars think that is when Luke was writing the book of Luke. Not Acts yet. He wrote Luke first. And Luke is taking advantage of being in Caesarea, being near all of the eyewitnesses that were still alive at that point in time, doing lots of interviews. Now, speaking of eyewitnesses, when was this written? Well, if he was in Caesarea and it was around the time of Paul's first imprisonment in Caesarea, that puts Luke finishing the book of Luke probably in the very early 60s. Now, this is going to be 30 years after Jesus's death, roughly. There's many hundreds of eyewitnesses that are still alive, including, most likely, scholars think, Mary, the mother of Jesus, still living in that region that Luke was in. It's highly likely he interviewed her as well. All right, our last literary question is, why was the book of Luke written? Now, if we were to pan out really big picture, we would say the book of Luke was written to tell an orderly account. Luke tells us this. Oh, we're going to get more into that. Luke tells us an orderly account, a full, expansive account of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. He tells us right away that that's why he's writing this. He specifically says to Theophilus, so that you may be certain in the things that you have been instructed. Here's a secondary reason that maybe Luke was writing both Luke and Acts. It is thought that it is likely that the writings of Luke, so the book of Luke and the book of Acts, was actually Luke somewhat acting like a lawyer, gathering evidence for the trial that Paul would be at. Luke is giving this very orderly, expansive account of not only Jesus's life in Luke, but also the birth of the church, Paul's salvation, Paul's early ministry. It was like a defense brief that Paul would maybe use during his trial before Caesar. All right, so that is our literary context. Now, we're going to turn the corner and we're going to do a context that Andy and I have made up, and we're calling that, remember, relational context. Now, what we want to do is we want to the best of our ability, and there's going to be a lot of speculation and a lot of, well, maybe, and I think, and we can kind of infer that maybe this was true about Luke, about his head, how he thought, his heart, how he felt, and his hands, what he did. There's a lot that we can learn about Luke, that we can befriend Luke, that we can try to get into the skin of Luke to understand him as a real human. I think too often we think about the Bible as almost like floating down from heaven, just straight from God. That is not how God chose to give us his words. He chose to give us his words through a man, in this instance, named Luke, who had thoughts, who had feelings, who did a lot of stuff. He had his own writing style. He had his own slant. When he heard the gospel, just like we bring to Bible Lab a very unique perspective, Luke brings to us an extremely unique perspective based off of his own head, heart, and hands. So let's start to sort of dig and see what we can find. Per usual, we're going to start with the head. First things first, Luke was extremely educated. And the reason we can say this with pretty good certainty is his writing style. The way that he wrote both Luke and Acts is from not only a very intelligent person, but a well-educated, grammatically correct, precise person. So he was well-educated. He was also a physician. He was a doctor. Now, don't think doctor like our doctors that hold some sort of status. That may have been true for Luke, but it could have been just as true that doctors in that day and age were not held, like barely educated doctors, somewhat quacks, poor. That could be a doctor too. Now, the reason I don't think that's true for Luke specifically, I think he was well educated and he was also a physician, which probably put him in that category away from the lower status doctors and probably put him more to the higher status, more educated, coming from a wealthier family where maybe his dad and his grandfather were doctors. That's how it would sort of pass down the line. So that is more likely than not. Luke being highly educated, a doctor, scientifically minded, most likely. So he's trained in the science of the body. So he's got that bent. Are you starting to just kind of get a picture of Luke? Maybe even someone that you know, intelligent, articulate, detail-oriented. Our friend Luke was detail-oriented. He liked all the facts. He was going to research for probably 2 years of research and writing all the details. When he said, "Most excellent Theophilus, I'm going to give you a very detailed account of Jesus's life," he meant it. Oh, I feel like I can see Luke with like all these like parchments and papers, and as he's going from house to house or maybe even village to village, doing a little bit of traveling as he's doing interviews and sitting down with them and writing and taking note and asking questions. He seems to me to be the kind of person, do you know this person where they're like, you're talking and they can retain so much knowledge and information and they are very detailed. Well, they'll be like, well, actually, what's really true, I think he might have been might have been, maybe, was that kind of person. Maybe our friend Luke was a head first person. We cannot know. But if I had to guess, looking at what I'm looking at, I'm like, oh, I think there's a good possibility our friend Luke might have been head first. Now, let's move to heart. This has struck me the most because as I look at how he's educated and intelligent and detailed and well-researched and quite confident, we'll get into that in a second, his heart for people. Now, I'm going to say his heart. He shows through his narrative writing the heart of Jesus for the common person. In particular, he highlights over and over, more than any gospel in the New Testament, how Jesus felt about children. And let me tell you, they were the very lowest of the low on the social hierarchy. They just didn't matter. He highlighted how Jesus said, no, they do matter and they're very important. He highlighted more women than any other gospel. Jesus's interaction with these women and the social outcasts. It would seem that as Luke heard these stories and with the power of the Holy Spirit in him to do this writing, that the part of Jesus that he most reflects back out to us is this unbelievable love for the common, everyday person, woman, child that others did not see nor thought were important. Luke's like, oh, there's a man named Jesus that did think they were important, and it's a sight to behold. And the second thing that I noticed about his heart, which kind of combines with his mind, I believe it's the first 4 verses, but in Greek, it's actually one sentence. Their sentences are much longer than our sentences. So it's the first 4 verses of Luke are written in an academic, scholarly, elite language, if you will, of that day. Which, when scholars who know the language look at this and they know the culture, they know the background, they know the linguistics, they look at that first sentence and say, oh, this man Luke was not just someone off the streets. He was all the things that we said before about his mind. But instead of doing his whole work like that, scholarly, intense, making himself look smart, he just set up, I believe, he set it up to say, I could write the whole thing this way, but what he does after that very first sentence is he brings his language all the way down. Because remember, he's showing how Jesus felt to the common person, to the child, to the woman, to the outcast. He wanted them to be able to read it, or more likely, have it read to them in a way they could actually understand. And if he kept his highfalutin language, they would not be able to understand him. So he sets aside, I do think this is a position of the heart, he sets aside his abilities to make himself sound intelligent and academic, to bring the language all the way down. I think that shows us the humility of heart powered by the Holy Spirit to do this work. All right, last, let's get to Luke's hands. Luke was Paul's companion, like we've said, and that meant he not only lived and worked and ministered with Paul, he suffered with Paul. In 2 Corinthians and other places within the Bible, Paul gives long lists of how he has suffered. And remember, the Corinthians were just so embarrassed of Paul because he actually had suffered so much. It wasn't just Paul being a martyr. No, it was a known fact that Paul had been beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, bitten by a snake. All these things that happened to Paul that people were kind of like cringy and thinking like, ooh, is God really with you? Well, Luke took on those very same things as he traveled and did ministry with Paul. So his hands, his body was willing to suffer. He was willing to be ridiculed. He was willing to be persecuted. Number 2, what did his hands do? He took upon himself to write a gospel. Now, I don't think there's any way Luke knew this would be in the Bible. He didn't even know there was a Bible at that time. We've got to remember, there were many different eyewitness accounts written down, lots of oral tradition passed through the mouth during those 30 years. Some written down, a lot passed through their mouth. And Luke looked around. I'm sure he read Matthew, he read Mark. Those were written before Luke. John was not written yet, so he couldn't read that. And he thought this: there needs to be a more orderly, expansive account of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection written. And what I would assume is through the prompting of the Holy Spirit to say, yeah, I'll do that. Now, we got to remember a couple things. Luke was not a Jew. With 99.9% certainty, he was probably a Greek. I think he was from Antioch. So he's a Gentile, number one. So that's a big strike against him. Number two, he was not an eyewitness. Matthew, Mark, in the future, John, they were eyewitnesses. They were there. They saw it. I think it's very interesting that he didn't let that stop him. He thought, no, I'm going to use my skills of research and detail and do the hard work of writing this book. And the fruits of that labor with his hands, what he chose to do, not just with his hands, actually, that would be full body of like, he chose to do it with his head, his heart humbled and submitted, and the work of the research and the detail and the interviewing and the traveling, all of that. Luke has written more of the New Testament than Paul. Now, Paul has the most letters. Paul wrote the most books of the Bible. Luke wrote the most words. God used him through the power of the Spirit to write more words than the Apostle Paul. And he was a Gentile and not an eyewitness, but God used him in ways that have just been encouraging to me. So that is our relational context for our good friend, Luke. If you're wondering what this Bible Lab thing is all about, check out this video. It'll tell you a little bit more about it.